Tonight, we will explore Buddhist teachings that have been quietly transforming lives for over 2,000 years. Not because they're complex or require years of study, but because they're so simple, so obvious once you see them, they change how you experience everything. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. Our journey tonight will uncover insights that can shift your entire relationship with being alive. These aren't abstract philosophical concepts. They're practical wisdoms that can change how you meet each moment, how you hold your struggles, how you find peace, even when life refuses to cooperate with your plans. While you're here, let yourself settle. Let your body find its own comfort. You're exactly where you need to be. Relax. Take a slow, deep breath. And let's begin our journey together. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from defending who you think you are. Not the tiredness of physical work or even mental effort, but the deep fatigue of constantly maintaining an image. The story of being capable, or wounded, or strong, or struggling. The narrative you've been telling yourself for so long that you've forgotten it's just a story. Most people don't realize they're living inside a narrative about themselves. They think their self-concept is simply who they are. And here's what makes this particularly exhausting. You have to keep proving the story is true. If you believe you're anxious, you look for evidence of your anxiety. If you identify as strong, you can't let anyone see weakness. If your story is that you're not good enough, you'll find ways to confirm that belief even when reality offers different evidence. The Buddha taught something radical about this. He said there is no fixed self to defend. What we call me is actually a constantly changing process, not a solid thing. But we grasp onto these stories about ourselves like they're life rafts, not realizing they're the very thing weighing us down. In a monastery high in the mountains, there lived a monk whose calligraphy was renowned throughout the region. For 30 years, people had traveled from distant villages to see his work. Emperors commissioned his scrolls. Other monks spoke his name with reverence. The master of the brush, they called him. And over those 3 decades, this title had become more than a name. It had become who he believed he was. Every morning before dawn, he would rise and practice his art in the quiet meditation hall. The sound of brush against paper was like a form of prayer. Each stroke perfect, each character balanced. His identity had become inseparable from the beauty he could create with ink and rice paper. But as he moved into his 60s, something began to change. His hands, which had been so steady for all those years, began to tremble. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a slight wavering in lines that had once been perfectly controlled. He told himself it was temporary, perhaps from cold weather or too little sleep. He tried gripping the brush harder, working only in the early morning when his hands felt most steady. He began to hide his practice scrolls, showing only the ones where the trembling had been minimal. Each day, he would wake with a knot of fear in his stomach, wondering if today would be the day he could no longer create the perfect characters that everyone expected from the master of the brush. One morning, after yet another failed attempt to write without trembling, he found himself sitting before a blank scroll, unable to begin. His brush remained dry. He stared at the empty paper as the sun rose higher, light slowly filling the meditation hall. For the first time in 30 years, he had nothing to show for his morning practice. A young monk who had only been at the monastery for a few months entered the hall. He didn't yet know all the unspoken rules about when the master should be left alone. Seeing the older monk sitting so still, seeing the tears on his weathered face, the young monk approached with genuine concern. "Teacher, forgive me, but are you unwell?" His voice was soft, worried. The old master looked up. Something in the young monk's innocent question, his open face unmarked by judgment, broke through decades of carefully maintained composure. The words came out before he could stop them. "I am no one. For 30 years, I was the master of the brush. Now my hands shake and I cannot write. Without my art, I don't know what I am." The young monk sat down beside him, uninvited. He was new enough to the monastery that he hadn't yet learned to fear disrupting a master's private moments. He sat quietly for a moment, then spoke with the simple honesty of someone who hadn't learned to hide behind carefully chosen words. "Forgive me, teacher, but I'm confused. I thought you were the monk who teaches us to sit in meditation each morning. The one who laughs so kindly when I make clumsy mistakes pouring tea. The person who left food outside for the injured bird last week when he thought no one was watching. The one who sometimes hums while walking in the garden, just quiet enough that he thinks we can't hear." The master sat very still, these words landing in him like stones in a pond. In the young monk's simple observation, he suddenly saw how completely he had imprisoned himself inside a single story. Master of the Brush was a tale he'd been telling for so long, had been believing so deeply that he'd forgotten he was the one telling it. He'd built an entire identity around one capacity. And now that this capacity was fading, he decided he was disappearing along with it. But the trembling in his hands hadn't erased his kindness. It hadn't eliminated his presence or his decades of meditation practice. It hadn't removed his ability to sit in the pre-dawn stillness or notice when a small bird needed help or feel joy humming in the garden. All of that remained, had always been there. Only the story was threatened. That afternoon, the master did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He picked up his brush without any intention of creating perfect calligraphy. Without trying to be the master of the brush. He let his hands shake as they would. The characters that emerged were wavering, imperfect, nothing like his legendary work. But as he placed each stroke, he noticed something he'd been too focused on perfection to feel before. The simple pleasure of brush meeting paper, the smell of ink, the morning light falling across the scroll, the breath moving in and out of his body as he worked. These things had always been there, but they'd been overshadowed by his need to prove he was who he thought he should be. When he hung the scroll on the wall, something about it stopped the other monks as they passed. It wasn't technically perfect. Far from it. But there was something alive in those trembling lines. A quality of presence, of a human hand meeting paper without pretense, without fear. Without the weight of maintaining an identity. One of the older monks stood looking at it for a long time. Finally, he said, "In all the years I've seen your work, this is the first piece that feels like I'm meeting the person who made it, not just admiring their skill." This story points to something you might recognize in your own life. Take a moment to consider the stories you tell about yourself. Not the obvious ones that you share with others, but the deeper narratives that shape how you move through each day, how you respond to challenges, how you relate to yourself. Notice how much energy it takes to maintain these stories. When you believe you're not good with people, you have to decline invitations, avoid conversations, hold back in groups, and gather evidence of your social awkwardness. The story requires constant reinforcement. And strangely, the story itself often creates the very behavior it describes. You're uncomfortable in social situations, partly because you're busy being someone who is uncomfortable in social situations. The master in our story discovered that his identity as master of the brush was something he was doing, not something he was. When his hands began to shake, he faced a choice, though he didn't see it as a choice at first. He could cling desperately to the story, trying to force reality to cooperate with his self-concept. Or he could let the story dissolve and discover what remained when he stopped defending it. What remained was simpler and more true. A person who existed regardless of whether his hands could create perfect calligraphy. Someone who could be present, kind, aware. Someone who could feel joy and compassion and stillness. These qualities had been there all along, but they'd been overshadowed by the louder story of being the master. Right now, as you're listening to these words, you might be able to sense some of the stories you're carrying. Maybe there's a tightness in your chest around certain identities. Maybe there's a familiar weight to certain thoughts about who you are. These sensations are often signals that you're maintaining a story, holding up an image that requires effort to sustain. The freedom isn't in figuring out who you really are and replacing one story with a better one. That's just trading one mask for another. The freedom is in recognizing that you're not the story at all. You're the awareness that can notice the story. The space in which stories arise and dissolve. The consciousness that remains regardless of what narrative happens to be playing. In a village at the base of the same mountain, there lived a woman who ran the local tea house. People in the village knew her well. They knew she had a sharp tongue, that she spoke her mind without hesitation, that she grew impatient quickly. "I've always been this way," she would say, with something close to pride. "My mother was like this. My grandmother too. It's just who I am." When customers took too long deciding what to order, she would make comments about wasting her time. When her young helper made small mistakes, forgetting to refill the tea kettle or placing cups in the wrong spot, she would let him know with words that carried an edge. She had built her entire personality around this directness, this unwillingness to tolerate what she saw as foolishness. Anyone who gently suggested she might try responding differently was met with the same reply, "This is who I am. I'm not going to pretend to be someone I'm not. At least people know where they stand with me." She defended this identity fiercely, as if being any different would make her false, would mean betraying something essential about herself. One autumn afternoon, a traveling monk stopped at her tea house. He was older, with quiet eyes and unhurried movements. He ordered simply, ate in silence, and seemed completely undisturbed by her brusque manner. She found his quietness unsettling. She was used to people either cowering slightly before her directness or pushing back against it. His complete lack of reaction to her sharp words left her feeling strangely off balance, as if she were performing for an audience that wasn't watching. As he was leaving, placing his payment carefully on the table, he paused and spoke the only words he'd said beyond his order. "The mask you wear so proudly must be very heavy." She felt a flash of irritation rising. She wanted to tell him he knew nothing about her, that she wasn't wearing any mask. But he was already gone, walking up the mountain path with those same unhurried steps, and her words died unspoken. That night, she lay awake long after the village had gone dark. His words circled in her mind. Mask? She wasn't wearing a mask. This was just who she was. Her mother had been this way. It was in her nature, wasn't it? But as she lay there in the darkness, she began to notice something she'd never paid attention to before. In the moment just before she spoke sharply to someone, there was a space. It was so brief, so fleeting, that she'd never seen it before. But it was there. A tiny moment where she could feel something else wanting to emerge, something softer, perhaps kinder, before she chose the familiar path of directness. She had been choosing to speak sharply, but the choice had been so automatic, so consistent with her story of who she was, that it hadn't felt like a choice at all. It had felt like simply being herself. But now she wondered, if there was a choice, even a tiny one, then maybe being herself was actually being the person she'd decided to be so long ago that she'd forgotten it was a decision. The next morning, a regular customer came in and fumbled with his coins, dropping several on the floor. The woman felt the familiar surge of impatience, the critical words forming in her mind about being careless, about wasting time. But this time, she saw that space before the reaction. Just for a moment, she didn't follow the familiar script. She simply bent down and helped the man gather his coins. The silence that followed felt strange, unfamiliar. Her young helper looked up with visible surprise. The customer thanked her with genuine warmth. And the woman felt something unexpected, lighter. As if she'd put down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was heavy. She didn't suddenly become a different person. Over the following weeks, she still felt impatience arise. Sometimes she still spoke with an edge, falling back into the familiar pattern. But increasingly, she found herself pausing in that brief space before reaction, not forcing herself to be patient, not pretending to be someone she wasn't, just not automatically following the script of who she thought she had to be. Her customers began to notice. Not all at once, but gradually. The tea house started to feel different, warmer somehow. A few people who had avoided coming too often began to visit more regularly. Her young helper seemed less tense, made fewer nervous mistakes. And the woman discovered something that both surprised and humbled her. Underneath the story of being sharp-tongued and impatient, there was someone who actually took pleasure in kindness. Someone who enjoyed seeing her customers relaxed and happy. She'd just never given that person room to exist because she'd been so busy being who she thought she was. When the traveling monk passed through the village again several months later, he stopped at her tea house. She served him tea and stood there for a moment, uncertain how to acknowledge what had shifted, how to thank someone for pointing out something she hadn't been ready to see. "The mask?" he asked gently, that same quietness in his eyes. "Was heavier than I knew," she admitted. "But I don't think I'm done figuring out who I am without it." The monk smiled, just slightly. "Good. The moment you think you've figured it out completely, you've just picked up a new mask. The freedom isn't in finding the right story about yourself. It's in not needing to be anyone in particular." This teaching points to something subtle but profound. The woman in the story wasn't being inauthentic when she spoke with that sharp edge. Her impatience was real. Her directness was genuine. But she turned a pattern of behavior into an identity, and then she'd become trapped in maintaining that identity. "This is just who I am," might be one of the most imprisoning things we can believe. Because the moment you identify completely with any pattern, you lose the freedom to respond freshly to each moment. You're not being authentic. You're being consistent with your story about yourself. And there's a difference. Real authenticity isn't about being faithful to some fixed personality. It's about being present enough to respond to what's actually happening, rather than what your story says someone like you should do in this situation. The tea house owner discovered that her identity didn't require maintaining that sharp edge. It was something she'd been choosing over and over for so long that the choosing had become invisible. When she started seeing the space before each reaction, she reclaimed her freedom to respond rather than to automatically perform her identity. You might begin to notice these spaces in your own life. The moment before you respond in the way you always respond. The instant before you prove once again that you're the kind of person you've always been. In that space, there's freedom. Not the freedom to become someone else, but the freedom to discover that you were never that fixed story to begin with. Your story isn't wrong. It's based on real patterns you've observed in yourself. But it's not the whole truth. And it's certainly not permanent truth. The person you think you are today is different from who you were 10 years ago, different from who you'll be in another 10 years. The person hearing these words right now is constantly changing with each breath, each thought, each moment of experience. The Buddha's teaching about no self isn't that you don't exist. It's that what you are is far more fluid, far more spacious, far less fixed than your story about yourself suggests. You're not a noun. You're more like a verb. Not a thing, but a process. Not a fixed identity, but an ongoing flow of experience, awareness, change. When you stop defending your narrative about yourself, when you stop trying to prove your story is true, an enormous amount of energy becomes available. Energy that was being used to maintain your self-concept can now flow into actually responding to life as it unfolds. You become free to meet each moment fresh rather than filtered through your story about who you are. The master discovered that his peace didn't depend on being able to create perfect calligraphy. The tea house owner discovered that her identity didn't require maintaining a sharp temperament. And you might discover tonight that you're far freer than your story has been allowing you to be. Not because you've changed who you are, but because you've stopped confusing yourself with the story about who you are. And in that recognition, something opens. A spaciousness, a lightness, the freedom to simply be present without the exhausting work of being someone in particular. As we move deeper into these teachings, you'll find that this insight opens doors to everything else. Because once you're not defending a fixed identity, you become available to wisdom. Once you're not protecting an image, you can be present with what actually is. Once you're not trapped in your story, you can meet life directly, freshly, without the filter of who you think you're supposed to be. Your story isn't you. And recognizing the difference changes everything. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from always needing to know. From having to understand everything, explain everything, be certain about everything. We live in a world that treats uncertainty as weakness and not knowing as something to be ashamed of. Questions are treated like problems to be solved as quickly as possible. Answers are valued above all else. And in this rush to know, we miss something essential. Most of us move through life trying to eliminate mystery. We want to know how things will turn out, understand why things happened, figure out what everything means. We treat uncertainty like an enemy to be conquered rather than a natural part of being alive. And in doing this, we create a particular kind of suffering. The suffering of always being slightly ahead of ourselves, always in our heads trying to figure things out, never quite present with what actually is. The Zen tradition speaks of something called don't know mind. Not as ignorance or confusion, but as a kind of openness that's actually wiser than certainty. When you don't already know the answer, you can actually see what's in front of you. When you're not certain how things should be, you can discover how they actually are. When you stop demanding that life makes sense according to your understanding, you become available to a deeper kind of knowing that doesn't come from your thinking mind. This isn't about becoming indifferent or giving up on learning. It's about recognizing that your need to know, to understand, to have everything figured out is often what keeps you trapped. Sometimes the most profound wisdom is found in staying with the question rather than rushing to an answer. In a temple known for its library of ancient texts, there was a monk who had dedicated 40 years to study. He had read thousands of sutras, could recite long passages from memory, and was consulted by other monks when they encountered difficult teachings. His knowledge was vast. His understanding seemed deep. Other monks looked at him with something like awe, and he had come to take quiet pride in being someone who understood things, someone who had answers. One spring, a teacher from another province came to visit. She was elderly, walked with a carved wooden staff, and had the kind of presence that made even the chattering birds seem to quiet as she passed. The scholarly monk, eager to engage with another learned person, approached her with questions about subtle points of doctrine he'd been contemplating. He explained his interpretations with care, cited various texts to support his understanding, displayed the depth of his study. He expected she would be impressed, that they would have a rich discussion about these complex matters. Instead, she listened with patient attention until he finished, then asked simply, "But have you ever sat with not understanding something? Really sat with it, without trying to figure it out?" The monk was puzzled by the question. "Not understanding means I need to study more. The path to wisdom is through learning, through comprehension. That's what all these years of study have been for." "Walk with me," she said. They walked through the temple gardens, where spring had recently arrived. New leaves were unfurling on the trees, small and bright green. The old teacher stopped before a cherry tree, its branches covered in pale pink blossoms. She stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. Then she turned to him and asked, "Explain this to me." The monk began readily. Cherry trees bloom in spring because of the warming temperatures and increased daylight, which trigger certain changes in the plant. The blossoms serve to attract pollinators for reproduction. The pink color comes from pigments in the petals. The process is well understood through botanical study and— "Stop," she said gently. "You've explained how it works. Now explain why it's beautiful." He paused. "Well, beauty is subjective. It's determined by cultural conditioning and perhaps certain evolutionary factors that make us responsive to particular visual patterns. There are theories about why humans find flowers aesthetically pleasing." "You're still explaining mechanisms," she interrupted, but her voice held no criticism, only kindness. "I'm asking you to sit with the mystery of this beauty, not to figure it out or explain it. Just to be present with the question of why this flower, in this moment, as you stand here breathing this morning air, touches something in you. Can you stay with not knowing the answer?" The monk stood there, realizing he had no response that didn't dissolve into more explanations. And yet the beauty was undeniably there, happening regardless of his understanding of it. For the first time in a very long while, he had to say, "I don't know." And in those 3 words, something shifted. he was suddenly present with the cherry blossoms themselves, rather than with his thoughts about cherry blossoms. "Good," the old teacher said. "Now you're beginning to see. All these years, you've been studying what other people wrote about reality. Their insights are valuable, yes, but you've rarely sat with reality itself. Your certainty about what you know has been preventing you from experiencing what is." Over the following days, the scholarly monk began to notice how his mind constantly reached for understanding, for explanation, for certainty. When another monk shared a difficulty they were facing, his mind would immediately search through all his learning for the right teaching, the proper response. He rarely just listened to what was actually being said. He was too busy trying to understand it, categorize it, find the answer. When he sat in meditation, he would try to understand what meditation was supposed to feel like, whether he was doing it correctly, what the experience meant. He could rarely just sit because he was too occupied with understanding sitting. One evening, he found the old teacher by the pond. He sat beside her in silence. The water was moving gently in the breeze, light playing across its surface in patterns that formed and dissolved. After a long while, he spoke. "I think I've been using knowledge as a kind of defense. If I understand everything, I don't have to face uncertainty. If I have answers, I don't have to be vulnerable to not knowing." She nodded slowly, her eyes still on the water. "And what have you discovered about that uncertainty you've been defending against?" He watched the pond, the way it was never the same from one moment to the next, always changing, always new. That maybe it's not an enemy. Maybe not knowing isn't a problem to solve. Maybe wisdom isn't about having all the answers. Maybe it's about being at peace with the questions. Even the Buddha said that all explanations are incomplete, the teacher said quietly. Words and concepts can point toward truth, but they can never capture it fully. The moment you think you've understood something completely, you've turned living truth into dead knowledge. You've traded the actual flower for your idea about flowers. The scholarly monk continued his studies after the old teacher left. He still read the ancient texts, still valued learning. But something fundamental had changed. He could say, "I don't know," without feeling like he'd failed. He could sit with questions without needing to immediately resolve them. He could be present with another person's struggle without rushing to fix it with the right teaching. And paradoxically, by becoming comfortable with not knowing, he became wise in a way that all his knowledge had never achieved. People began coming to him not because he had answers, but because he could sit with them in their questions. Because he'd learned that sometimes the most helpful thing isn't an explanation, but a presence that can hold the mystery alongside you. This story reveals something about how we relate to knowledge and understanding. We're taught from childhood that intelligence means having answers, that wisdom means knowing what to do, that strength means being certain. Not knowing feels like a kind of failure, an admission of inadequacy. And so we work very hard to always have explanations, to understand everything, to never be caught without an answer. But notice what this costs. Think about your own relationship with uncertainty. How does it feel when someone asks you something and you genuinely don't know? When you face a situation and can't figure out what it means or what to do? For most people, not knowing creates a kind of anxiety. We feel exposed, as if our uncertainty reveals something shameful about us. But there's a different possibility. When you can genuinely say, "I don't know," without it feeling like failure, something opens. Your mind stops its frantic search for answers. You become present with what actually is, rather than what you think should be. You're available to discover something new rather than just confirming what you already believe. The scholarly monk in our story had confused knowledge with wisdom. He could explain mechanisms, cite authorities, analyze concepts. But all of that understanding was actually keeping him at a distance from direct experience. He was experiencing his thoughts about cherry blossoms rather than the cherry blossoms themselves. He was so busy knowing about life that he'd forgotten how to simply be alive. Real wisdom includes the humility to recognize what can't be known. Some questions don't have neat answers. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, but lived with. Some things are too complex, too alive, too real to be fully captured by explanations. And sometimes the most intelligent response to life's depths is simply, I don't know, and I'm present with what's actually here. In a village by the sea, there lived a fisherman who prided himself on being practical and sensible. He knew the tides, could read the weather, understood which fish ran at which times of year. He dealt with what was real and knowable. I don't waste time on questions that have no answers, he would say. Life is difficult enough without making it more complicated. His young daughter was different. From the time she was small, she would ask questions like, where does the sea end? And why do we have to die? And what makes something matter? He would dismiss these questions gently but firmly. Those are children's wonderings. When you're older, you'll understand that these questions lead nowhere. Focus on what you can actually know and do. But she didn't outgrow it. As she became a young woman, the questions remained, though she learned to keep them to herself. Her father could see them in her eyes sometimes, a searching quality that worried him. She grew quieter, more distant. The questions she couldn't ask and couldn't answer seemed to weigh on her. When she was 17, she became ill with a fever that the village healer couldn't explain or cure. She grew weaker, and the fisherman found himself facing something his practical knowledge couldn't solve. He sat by her bedside, holding her hand, feeling more helpless than he'd ever felt in his life. One night, exhausted and frightened, he found himself doing something he'd never done before. He spoke to the darkness, to the sea beyond the window, to whatever might be listening. Why? He asked. What's the meaning of this? Why her? All the questions he'd spent his life dismissing came pouring out. And he had no answers. His careful understanding of tides and fish and weather meant nothing here. He was completely, utterly lost in not knowing. His daughter stirred and opened her eyes. She saw the tears on his weathered face. "Father, what's wrong?" "I don't understand any of this," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know why you're ill. I don't know what to do. I've never felt so lost." She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. For the first time in years, something like peace crossed her face. "It's all right not to know," she whispered. "I've been living with these questions my whole life. They're not problems to solve. They're just part of being alive. You don't have to understand everything to love me. You don't have to have answers to be here with me." Something in her words reached him in a way nothing else had. He'd been so busy trying to have everything figured out that he'd missed what was actually important. He'd treated his daughter's questions as weaknesses when they were actually a kind of wisdom, the wisdom to live with mystery rather than pretending certainty where there was none. She recovered slowly over the following weeks. The fever left as mysteriously as it had come, and the healer had no explanation for why. During those long days of her recovery, the fisherman discovered something new. Sitting with her in the not knowing, in the uncertainty of whether she would fully heal, was its own kind of presence. He couldn't fix her with his practical knowledge, but he could be with her completely, without needing to understand or explain what was happening. One evening, when she was finally strong enough to sit up and look out at the sea, she asked him one of her old questions. "Father, what do you think makes life meaningful?" In the past, he would have offered a practical answer about family and work and being useful. Or he would have dismissed the question as unanswerable. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, watching the light change on the water. Then he said, "I don't know, but sitting here with you, not knowing, feels meaningful." Maybe meaning isn't something you figure out. Maybe it's something you experience when you stop trying to have everything explained. She smiled, really smiled, for the first time in weeks. "That's the wisest thing I've ever heard you say." From that day on, the fisherman still knew the tides and the weather and where the fish ran. He was still practical and capable, but he held his knowledge more lightly. When his daughter asked her deep questions, he would sit with her in the wondering rather than trying to dismiss it. And he discovered that the questions he'd spent his life avoiding were actually doorways to a different kind of knowing. Not the knowing of facts and certainty, but the knowing that comes from being fully present with what is, even when, especially when, it can't be fully understood. This story points to something you may have experienced yourself. Think about the moments when you felt most alive, most connected, most present. Were those usually moments of certainty, of having everything figured out? Or were they moments of genuine openness, of being present with mystery? The fisherman had spent his life building walls of certainty, protecting himself from the vulnerability of not knowing. But when life brought him to a place where his certainty couldn't help him, where his practical knowledge had no answers, he discovered that not knowing wasn't the disaster he'd feared. It was where genuine human connection happened. It was where love could flow without being blocked by the need to understand or control. We spend enormous energy trying to figure everything out, to understand why things happened the way they did, to predict what will happen next, to have explanations ready for all of life's questions. But notice how exhausting this is. Notice how your need for certainty often keeps you at arm's length from direct experience. When you're with someone who's suffering, your rush to understand why or to offer solutions can prevent you from simply being present with their pain. When something beautiful happens, your need to explain it or capture it or figure out what it means can stop you from actually experiencing it. When life brings unexpected change, your demand for it to make sense can prevent you from simply meeting what's actually occurring. There's a teaching in Buddhism called emptiness. Not that nothing exists, but that nothing exists in the fixed, certain, permanent way our minds want it to. Everything is more fluid, more mysterious, more open than our concepts can capture. And there's profound freedom in recognizing this. Freedom from the exhausting work of trying to pin everything down, explain everything, have everything figured out. When you stop needing to know everything, you become available to learn from everything. When you release your certainty about how things are, you can discover how they actually are, which is always richer and more complex than your explanations. When you embrace not knowing, you become genuinely curious rather than just seeking to confirm what you already believe. This doesn't mean abandoning reason or knowledge. The scholarly monk didn't stop studying. The fisherman didn't stop using his practical understanding. But both discovered that wisdom includes recognizing the limits of what can be known and being at peace with mystery. Right now, you might notice areas of your life where you're exhausting yourself trying to understand things that perhaps can't be fully understood. Why someone did what they did, what your life means, whether you're making the right choices, what will happen next. These aren't bad questions, but they become a source of suffering when you can't rest until you have certain answers. Sometimes the most honest, most wise response is simply, "I don't know." And surprisingly, there's peace in that admission. A relaxation that comes from no longer having to defend a position or maintain a certainty. An openness that allows life to show you things you couldn't discover if you already had all the answers. The gift of not knowing isn't ignorance. It's freedom from the prison of needing to be certain about everything. It's the spaciousness that allows life to meet you freshly in each moment rather than being filtered through your pre-existing understanding. It's the humility that recognizes that reality is always larger, deeper, more mysterious than your thoughts about it. As you continue listening, you might find yourself approaching these teachings with this same openness, not trying to understand them completely or fit them into what you already know, not rushing to figure out what they mean or how to apply them, just staying present with what arises as you hear them, letting the teachings meet you rather than trying to grasp them, discovering that sometimes wisdom comes not from understanding, but from the quality of presence you bring to not understanding. This is the gift, the freedom to not have all the answers, the peace that comes from being at ease with mystery, the wisdom that emerges when you stop trying to figure everything out and start being present with what actually is. There's a teaching in Buddhism about 2 arrows. The first arrow is the pain that life brings: loss, disappointment, illness, difficulty, change. This arrow is unavoidable. It's part of being alive in a world where things don't last, where bodies age, where people leave, where plans fall apart. You cannot live without encountering this first arrow. It will find you again and again in small ways and large ones. But then there's the second arrow. This is the one we shoot at ourselves. It's the story we tell about the pain, the meaning we make of it, the shame we feel, the resistance, the why me, the this shouldn't be happening, the comparing ourselves to others who seem to have it easier, the belief that this difficulty says something permanent about us or our lives. This second arrow is where most of our suffering actually comes from. The remarkable thing, the life-changing thing, is that we have no choice about the first arrow, but the second arrow is completely optional. You can experience pain without creating a whole world of suffering around it. You can meet difficulty without adding layers of mental anguish on top of it. This isn't about positive thinking or pretending pain doesn't hurt. It's about recognizing how much additional suffering we create through our relationship with pain. When the first arrow strikes, it hurts. That's real. That's honest. But then our minds get busy. We start asking why this happened to us. We compare our situation to others. We make the pain mean something about our worth or our future. We resist what's already occurring. We replay it, analyze it, turn it into a story about ourselves. And each of these movements of mind is another arrow we're shooting at ourselves. In a farming village surrounded by rice fields, there were two families whose land bordered each other. They'd been neighbors for generations, their children growing up together, their families sharing meals during harvest time. One year, an unexpected late frost came in spring and destroyed both families' carefully planted crops. The first arrow, the loss of the harvest, struck both families equally. The weather made no distinction between them. The first farmer, a man named Jiro, stood looking at his blackened fields and felt something collapse inside him. Within hours, his mind had already built an entire story around the loss. "This is what always happens to us," he said to his wife. "My father struggled with bad luck, and now we're cursed with the same fate. Nothing good ever lasts for our family. We'll never recover from this. Other families have fortune smile on them, but we're the ones who suffer." He stopped going out to tend what remained of his fields. What was the point? Everything he touched seemed to fail anyway. When neighbors stopped by to offer help or share what they had, he turned them away, too ashamed to face them. He couldn't stop thinking about how the year should have gone, how other farmers still had their crops, how unfair it was that this had happened to them. His children absorbed his despair like rain soaking into dry ground. They began to believe they too were marked by bad fortune. His wife grew tired under the weight of his bitterness. The loss of one harvest became a story of generational curse, personal failure, and hopeless future. The second arrow Jiro shot at himself and kept shooting was far more damaging than the frost had been. The second farmer, whose name was Kenji, stood in his own ruined field feeling the sharp pain of the loss. The first arrow hurt. He didn't pretend otherwise. He felt the disappointment deeply, felt the worry about feeding his family through the coming year. He sat down right there in the blackened field and let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. He didn't try to push it away or tell himself it wasn't that bad. The loss was real, and he honored that reality with his grief. But he didn't add a story to it. He didn't make it mean something about himself or his family or their fate. He didn't spend energy asking why this had happened to them specifically. He didn't compare his situation to the neighbors whose fields were at a higher elevation and had been spared. He didn't look for someone or something to blame. The frost had come. The crops were lost. It was painful, and it was what had happened. Not a punishment, not a sign, not a statement about his worth or his future, just a difficulty to be met. After sitting with his grief for a time, feeling it fully without resistance, he noticed something. The pain didn't consume him. It was there, real and present, but it didn't become his whole reality. There was still the sky above the ruined field, still his breath moving in and out, still his wife and children who needed him present, not lost in a story about their fate. He began to consider what could be done with what remained. He talked to other farmers about which crops might still be planted this late in the season. Buckwheat, perhaps. Some quick-growing vegetables. He took work helping neighbors with their harvests, earning what his family would need. He taught his children that difficulty was part of life, not a punishment or a sign of failure, and that how you meet difficulty matters more than whether you encounter it. When his son asked, "Father, why did this happen to us?" Kenji sat with the question for a moment. Then he said, "The frost came. That's what happened. It wasn't aimed at us. It wasn't about us. It's just what weather sometimes does. Now our work is to respond to what is, not to make up stories about why. By autumn, Kenji's family had less than they would have had with a full harvest. Their year had been harder, but they hadn't suffered the collapse of spirit that had taken hold of Jiro's household. They had met the first arrow with resilience rather than shooting themselves with 1,000 second arrows. The pain had been real, but it had been just pain, not a catastrophe of meaning and identity. This story shows something that happens in our own lives all the time, often without us noticing. Life brings difficulties. This is the first arrow, and it's unavoidable. Someone speaks to us harshly. We don't get the opportunity we hoped for. Our body gets ill. A relationship ends. We make a mistake. These things hurt. They're supposed to hurt. Pain is part of being alive and caring about things. But then watch what the mind does. It doesn't just feel the pain. It creates stories about the pain. And these stories are the second arrow, or really the second, third, fourth, and 100th arrow, because once we start shooting them, we tend to keep going. This always happens to me. That's an arrow. I don't deserve good things. Another arrow. Everyone else has it easier. Arrow. This proves I'm not good enough. Arrow. My life is falling apart. Arrow. I'll never recover from this. Arrow. Notice how different these arrows are from the original pain. The harsh words someone spoke, that was the first arrow, and it hurt. But this always happens to me, and I'm not worthy of respect, and I'll always be treated this way. These are the second arrows, and they can hurt far more than the original wound. Jiro and Kenji faced the exact same difficulty, the same frost, the same loss, the same first arrow. But Jiro multiplied his suffering by shooting himself repeatedly with second arrows, while Kenji experienced the pain without adding layers of meaning and story on top of it. This is the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is what we add to pain through resistance and story. You might notice this pattern in your own life right now. Think about something that's been bothering you, some difficulty you're facing. There's the actual situation. That's the first arrow. But then notice all the thoughts surrounding it. The stories about what it means. The comparisons to how things should be. The fear about what it says about your future. The shame about not handling it better. These are all second arrows. And here's what's remarkable. When you stop shooting the second arrows, the first arrow becomes much more bearable. Not because you're denying the pain or pretending everything is fine, but because you're just dealing with what's actually happening instead of dealing with what's happening plus all your stories about what's happening. In a monastery not far from that same village, there were two young monks who both struggled with meditation. Sitting still was difficult for both of them. Their minds wandered. Their bodies ached. Their thoughts scattered like leaves in wind. The first arrow, the difficulty of meditation, struck them both equally. The first monk, whose name was Tenzo, would sit in the meditation hall fighting with his wandering mind. Every time a thought arose, he would think, "I'm doing this wrong. I'm terrible at meditation. Everyone else can concentrate and I can't. I'll never make progress. What's wrong with me?" He would glance around the hall, seeing other monks sitting perfectly still, and feel a deep shame. After meditation, he would avoid the other monks, certain they could see his failure. He began to dread meditation periods. The physical discomfort of sitting was bad enough, but the mental torment he added to it was worse. He would lie awake at night, worrying about the next day's meditation, rehearsing his failure before it even happened. The difficulty of meditation, the first arrow, had become buried under so many second arrows that he could barely feel the original challenge anymore. He was suffering from his story about his meditation far more than from the meditation itself. The second monk, whose name was Iko, also had a wandering mind. His thoughts also scattered. His body also ached during long periods of sitting. But when these things happened, he would simply notice them. Thinking. He would observe gently when his mind wandered. Discomfort when his leg went numb. He didn't make these experiences mean anything about his worth as a monk or his progress on the path. He didn't compare himself to the others sitting in the hall. He didn't know what was happening in their minds. All he knew was what was happening in his own experience, and his work was just to be present with that, whatever it was. Wandering mind? That's what was present. Aching back? That's what was present. Neither good nor bad. Just what was happening in this moment. After several months, their teacher noticed the difference between them. Tenzo looked increasingly strained, his shoulders tight with effort and worry. Iko seemed more at ease, even though his meditation wasn't better in any obvious way. One day, the teacher asked them both to stay after the evening sitting. "Tell me about your meditation," he said to Tenzo. "It's terrible, Master," Tenzo said, his voice heavy with defeat. "I can't concentrate. My mind wanders constantly. I'm making no progress. I think perhaps I'm not suited for this practice." The teacher turned to Iko. "And yours?" "My mind wanders constantly," Iko said with a slight smile. "Some days more, some days less. But I'm learning to be patient with it." The teacher looked at them both. "You're both describing the same experience, the same wandering mind. But one of you is suffering greatly, and the other is at peace. Tenzo, what do you think is the difference?" Tenzo was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly, he said, "I think I'm not just experiencing my wandering mind. I'm also experiencing all my thoughts about my wandering mind, all my judgments about it, all my comparisons to others, all my worry about what it means." "Yes," the teacher said gently. "The wandering mind is the first arrow. It strikes every beginning meditator. But you're shooting yourself with many second arrows. Your mind wanders, that's one difficulty. But then you judge yourself for it, compare yourself to others, worry about your future progress, feel ashamed. These are additional difficulties you're creating." Iko's mind also wanders, but he's not adding all these extra layers of suffering. Tenzo felt something shift as he heard this. All this time, he'd thought his problem was that he couldn't meditate properly. But actually, his problem was all the suffering he was adding to the simple difficulty of meditation. The wandering mind wasn't the issue. His relationship with the wandering mind was the issue. Over the following weeks, Tenzo began to practice differently. When his mind wandered, he would notice if he was about to shoot a second arrow at himself. About to think, "I'm doing this wrong," or "I'm not good enough." And sometimes he could catch himself before he shot that arrow. He could just notice the wandering mind without adding a story about what it meant. It didn't make his mind wander less. but it made the wandering mind so much easier to work with. And gradually, he stopped dreading meditation. Not because he'd become good at it, but because he'd stopped making his difficulty into a disaster. This story reveals something subtle but profound about how suffering works. The two monks had the same challenge, the same first arrow, but one experienced just the challenge, while the other experienced the challenge plus enormous additional suffering from his stories about the challenge. This happens in every area of life. You make a mistake at work, that's the first arrow. It feels bad. It should feel bad. Mistakes have consequences. But then the mind adds, I'm incompetent. Everyone must think I'm stupid. I'll probably get fired. I always mess things up. These are second arrows, and they can be more painful than the original mistake. Your body gets sick, first arrow. Then, this is unfair. Why me? I must have done something wrong to deserve this. My body is betraying me. I'll never be healthy again. Second, third, fourth arrows. Someone you care about is upset with you, first arrow. Then, I'm a terrible person. I always hurt people. This relationship is doomed. No one will ever really love me. More arrows. The practice, the life-changing practice, is learning to feel the first arrow fully without shooting the second ones. This doesn't mean you don't feel pain. It means you feel the actual pain without adding all the extra suffering your mind wants to create around it. When you experience difficulty, you can ask yourself, what's the first arrow here? What's the actual situation I'm dealing with? And then, what are the second arrows? What stories am I adding? What meanings am I making? What comparisons am I drawing? What fears am I projecting into the future? You'll find that the first arrow by itself is often bearable. Difficult, yes. Painful, yes. But bearable. It's the second arrows that make it feel unbearable. It's the stories that turn pain into suffering. Right now, you might be carrying difficulties that feel overwhelming. But if you look closely, you might find that a lot of that overwhelm comes from the stories you're telling about the difficulty rather than from the difficulty itself. The job loss is hard, that's the first arrow. But I'm a failure and I'll never recover is a second arrow. The illness is painful, that's the first arrow. But this is unfair and I must have done something to deserve this is a second arrow. When you stop shooting these second arrows, something remarkable happens. You have more energy to actually deal with the difficulty. You're not exhausting yourself with resistance and story. You're present with what is, and from that presence, wise response becomes possible. This is what the Buddha meant when he taught about the end of suffering. Not the end of pain. Pain is part of life. But the end of the suffering we add to pain. The end of the second arrow. And that end is available not by changing your circumstances, but by changing your relationship with your circumstances. By learning to meet the first arrow without shooting the second. As you continue through these teachings, you might notice yourself starting to distinguish between first and second arrows in your own experience. This noticing itself is the beginning of freedom. Not freedom from difficulty, but freedom within difficulty. The freedom to experience life's inevitable pains without multiplying them into suffering. There's a kind of wisdom that our culture rarely talks about. We're taught to value action, decisiveness, doing something, making things happen. When we see a problem, we're supposed to fix it. When someone is upset, we're supposed to make them feel better. When there's silence, we're supposed to fill it. When something isn't working, we're supposed to do more, try harder, push through. But there's another kind of wisdom that the Zen tradition honors deeply. It's the wisdom of restraint, of knowing when not to act, when not to speak, when not to fix or intervene or try to make something happen. This isn't passivity or indifference. It's a much more subtle and difficult practice. It's the practice of trusting that not everything requires your intervention. That sometimes the most helpful thing is to do nothing at all. This goes against every instinct we've been taught. When we see someone struggling, we want to help. When something feels wrong, we want to make it right. When there's a gap, we want to fill it. When there's discomfort, we want to resolve it. These impulses come from care, from compassion, from a genuine desire to be helpful. But sometimes these very impulses create more problems than they solve. Sometimes your action, however well-intentioned, interrupts a process that needs to unfold naturally. Sometimes your words, however carefully chosen, prevent someone from finding their own words. Sometimes your help, however generous, prevents someone from developing their own strength. Sometimes your solution, however clever, stops people from discovering their own wisdom. The practice of restraint asks you to pause before acting, to feel the impulse to do something and then ask, is this action truly needed? Or am I just uncomfortable with not doing anything? Am I acting because the situation needs action, or because I need to feel like I'm helping? In a village known for its pottery, there was a master potter who had trained many apprentices over the years. She was known not just for her skill, but for the way she taught. Her current apprentice was a young man named Daichi, who showed great promise, but also great impatience. He wanted to master the craft quickly, wanted to create beautiful pieces, wanted to prove himself capable. One day, Daichi was working on a large bowl, the biggest piece he'd attempted. He'd centered the clay on the wheel, pulled up the walls, and was shaping the rim. The master sat nearby, quietly mending a tool. As Daichi worked, the rim began to develop an uneven spot. His hands moved quickly to correct it, but in his haste, he pressed too hard. The bowl collapsed inward, ruined. He sat back, frustrated. I saw it starting to go wrong. I tried to fix it, but I made it worse. The master set down her work. "Let's try again," she said. "But this time, I want you to make a bowl, and I want you to watch what your hands want to do. Notice every impulse to fix, to correct, to adjust. But don't act on those impulses right away. Breathe first. Wait. See if the action is truly needed." Daichi centered a new piece of clay and began again. As the bowl took shape, he noticed that small irregularity appearing again. His hands immediately wanted to reach for it, to smooth it out. But he remembered the master's instruction. He breathed. He waited. And as he waited, just a moment, the clay settled slightly on its own. The spot that had looked like a problem became part of the bowl's natural shape. Later, as the bowl continued to grow, another challenge appeared. A small crack began to form at the base. Again, his hands wanted to rush to fix it, to add water, to smooth it over, to do something. But he paused. He breathed. And in that pause, he saw something. The crack wasn't growing. It was actually stable. His intervention would have introduced water where it wasn't needed, which would have weakened the entire structure. When the bowl was complete, it wasn't perfect. It had the slight irregularity from earlier and a subtle texture where the crack had been. But it was whole. It was sound. And it was more beautiful than it would have been if he'd tried to control every moment of its creation. "What did you notice?" the master asked. "I noticed how often I wanted to fix things that weren't actually problems," Daichi said slowly. "How often my hands wanted to do something just because I was nervous, not because the clay needed it. And I noticed that when I waited, when I didn't act on every impulse, the clay showed me what it needed. Sometimes it needed nothing at all." The master nodded. "This is what I'm trying to teach you. Pottery is about knowing when to touch the clay and when to leave it alone. But life is the same. Sometimes the most skilled action is no action. Sometimes the deepest wisdom is in the restraint." Over the following months, Daichi began to notice this pattern everywhere. When other apprentices struggled with their work, his first impulse was always to jump in and help, to show them what to do. But he learned to wait. Sometimes they found their own solution. Sometimes they needed to struggle with the problem a bit longer. Sometimes his intervention would have robbed them of their own discovery. When the master seemed troubled by something, he would feel the urge to ask what was wrong, to try to fix it. But he learned that sometimes people need space to sit with their own thoughts. Sometimes silence is more respectful than questions. Sometimes being present without trying to solve anything is the greatest kindness. One day, a customer came to the studio upset about a piece she'd ordered. She'd wanted a tea bowl in a specific style, and what the master had created wasn't quite what she'd imagined. She was expressing her disappointment with increasing agitation. Daichi felt the strong urge to defend the master's work, to explain why it was actually better than what the customer had asked for, to fix the situation with words. But he watched the master, and the master simply listened. She didn't defend. She didn't explain. She didn't try to convince the customer of anything. She just listened with complete attention, occasionally nodding. And slowly, as the customer expressed everything she was feeling, something shifted. Her agitation settled. And then she looked at the bowl again, really looked at it, without her expectations clouding her vision. And she saw its beauty, which had been there all along, waiting to be noticed. "I think it's actually quite lovely," the customer said quietly. "I was so attached to what I thought I wanted that I couldn't see what was actually here. I'm sorry for getting upset." After she left, Daichi said to the master, "I wanted to say so many things, but you said nothing." "I said nothing because nothing needed to be said," the master replied. She needed space to move through her disappointment. My words would have interrupted that process. Sometimes, the most helpful thing you can offer someone is your patient silence while they find their own way through. This story points to something you might recognize in your own life. How often do you feel the impulse to act, to speak, to fix, to help, even when action might not be what's needed? This impulse usually comes from a good place. You care. You want to be useful. You want to prevent harm or ease suffering. But notice how uncomfortable it feels to not act when you see a problem or difficulty. That discomfort is often what drives you to intervene, not actual wisdom about whether intervention is helpful. You act to relieve your own discomfort with witnessing struggle, not because the situation truly needs your action. This is human and understandable, but it's not always helpful. Think about times when someone tried to help you, but their help actually made things harder. Maybe they jumped in to solve a problem before you'd had a chance to work through it yourself. Maybe they offered advice when what you really needed was just to be heard. Maybe they tried to cheer you up when you needed to feel your sadness. Maybe they couldn't tolerate your silence and filled it with words that prevented you from finding your own. Their intentions were good, but their inability to restrain their impulse to help ended up being unhelpful. The wisdom of restraint would have served you better than their well-meaning action. Daichi learned to feel the impulse to act and then pause before acting. To ask himself, is this action needed, or am I just uncomfortable with not acting? That pause, that moment of restraint, created space for wisdom to emerge. Space to see what was actually needed, rather than just following his impulse to do something. You can practice this same pause. When you feel the urge to speak, to fix, to help, to intervene, you can take a breath. Feel the impulse. And then ask, is this truly helpful, or am I just trying to relieve my own discomfort? Will my action serve the situation, or will it interrupt something that needs to unfold in its own time? In a mountain village, there was a healer known for her skill with herbs and remedies. People would come to her from distant places when they were ill, and she could often help them. But as she grew older, she began to notice something. Some people she could help with her remedies, but others, she realized, didn't actually need her herbs. They needed something else entirely, and sometimes her treatments, however skillfully prepared, actually got in the way of their real healing. A man came to her one day complaining of terrible headaches that had plagued him for months. He'd tried everything, seen other healers, but nothing helped. The pain was constant, disrupting his sleep, his work, his life. He looked exhausted from fighting with it. The healer's first instinct was to reach for her herbs, to mix him something for pain. Her entire identity was built around being someone who helped people with their ailments. But something made her pause. She sat with him for a while, asking questions, not about his symptoms, but about his life, his work, his relationships, his worries. It emerged slowly that the headaches had started shortly after his father died. He'd been very close to his father, but he'd barely taken time to grieve. There was the funeral to arrange, his mother to care for, his work to maintain. He'd kept himself busy, efficient, handling everything. The headaches came a few weeks later. The healer was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that surprised him. "I'm not going to give you anything for the pain. I think the pain is trying to tell you something. I think your body is asking you to finally stop and feel what you haven't let yourself feel." The man looked at her in disbelief. "But I came here to stop the pain, not to be told to feel it." "I know," she said gently. "And I could give you something that might dull it for a while. But I think it would come back, because you'd still be carrying what you haven't let yourself grieve. Sometimes pain isn't the problem. Sometimes it's the signal that there's something we need to pay attention to. And sometimes the most healing thing I can do is to not interfere with that signal." The man left disappointed, feeling that the healer had failed him. But he couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. And that evening, for the first time since his father's death, he allowed himself to really cry. Not the controlled tears at the funeral, but deep, shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere far inside him. He cried for an hour, and when he was done, he felt exhausted but somehow lighter. The headache was still there, but it was quieter. And over the following weeks, as he allowed himself to grieve, as he stopped trying to push past his sadness and just let himself feel it, the headaches gradually faded. They didn't disappear all at once, but they lost their intensity. And eventually, they were gone. Months later, he returned to the healer. "I came to thank you," he said, "for knowing when not to help. For seeing that what I called a problem was actually my body's wisdom trying to get my attention. If you'd given me something for the pain, I might have kept avoiding my grief for years." The healer smiled. "That's the hardest part of this work. Knowing when my remedies will help and when they'll just postpone what someone needs to face. Knowing when action is compassion and when restraint is the deeper compassion." She had another visitor that same day, a woman who had been treating herself for a persistent cough with various herbs she'd gathered herself. She'd tried remedy after remedy, each one carefully researched. But nothing was helping, and the cough was getting worse. The healer examined her and realized immediately that this wasn't something herbs could address. This woman needed to see a physician in the larger town. The cough suggested something more serious that required different treatment. "You need to stop treating yourself," the healer said firmly. "This is beyond what my herbs can do. You need to travel to the physician. This week, not later." The woman protested. She didn't want to make the journey. She didn't want to face the possibility that something was seriously wrong. But the healer insisted, giving her specific instructions about where to go and what to say. Later, a younger healer who had been observing asked, "How do you know when to tell someone you can't help them and when to tell someone they must get help? Earlier you sent that man away without treatment. Now you're insisting this woman seek treatment elsewhere." The old healer thought for a moment. The man didn't need treatment. He needed to stop avoiding his grief. My intervention would have given him another way to avoid it. But this woman needs help I can't provide. My restraint would be dangerous for her. Wisdom isn't always about doing nothing or always about doing something. It's about knowing which is truly helpful in each situation. "But how do you know?" the younger healer asked. "By being willing to be wrong. By being willing to sit with uncertainty. By not rushing to act just because I feel the pressure to do something. When I pause, when I really listen, when I'm not attached to being the one who fixes things, the right action usually becomes clear. Sometimes it's to act. Sometimes it's to refrain from acting. But the pause is always needed first." This story reveals another layer of the wisdom of restraint. It's not a rule that says never help or always hold back. It's a discernment that can only come from pausing before acting. From being willing to feel the uncertainty of not knowing immediately what to do. The healer had to learn to tell the difference between pain that needed treatment and pain that was actually trying to guide someone toward healing. She had to distinguish between when her remedies would help and when they would just postpone what someone needed to face. This required her to not automatically reach for her herbs just because that's what she knew how to do. How often do you offer your herbs, your solutions, your advice, your help, not because it's what's truly needed, but because it's what you know how to offer? Because it makes you feel competent and helpful? Because you're uncomfortable just witnessing someone struggle without fixing it? The wisdom of restraint asks you to get comfortable with that discomfort. To be able to sit with someone's difficulty without rushing to resolve it. To trust that sometimes people need to find their own way through, and your intervention, however well meant, would rob them of that discovery. This doesn't mean you should never help. The healer helped the woman by insisting she see the physician. Sometimes action is exactly what's called for. Sometimes restraint would be wrong. The wisdom is in knowing the difference, and that knowing comes from pausing long enough to feel into what's actually needed, rather than just reacting to your impulse to do something. You might notice this in conversations. Someone shares a difficulty, and you immediately feel the urge to offer advice, to fix it, to make it better. But what if you paused? What if you just listened? What if you trusted that sometimes people don't need solutions, they need to be heard? What if your silence, your presence, your restraint from jumping in with answers is actually the most helpful thing you can offer? Or in situations where someone is upset, your impulse might be to try to calm them down, to convince them they shouldn't feel that way, to distract them from their emotion. But what if the most compassionate thing is to let them feel what they feel? To not interfere with their emotional process? To trust that feelings, when allowed to move through naturally, have their own wisdom? The wisdom of restraint doesn't mean you become passive or uncaring. It means you become more truly responsive. You respond to what's actually needed rather than to your own discomfort with not acting. You trust that not everything requires your intervention. You develop the capacity to be present without needing to fix, to witness without needing to change, to care without needing to control. This is one of the most difficult practices because it goes against everything you've been taught about being helpful, being capable, being valuable. But it's also one of the most liberating. When you don't feel responsible for fixing everything, for having the answer to every problem, for making everyone comfortable, an enormous burden lifts. You can be present without being responsible. You can care without carrying. You can help when help is truly needed, and rest when it's not. This is the freedom that comes from the wisdom of restraint. The freedom to let things unfold in their own time, in their own way, knowing that not everything needs your hand in it. Knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing at all. There's something we all know intellectually, but resist with every fiber of our being. Everything changes. Nothing stays the same. Not the good things we want to hold on to. Not the difficult things we wish would end. Not our bodies, our relationships, our circumstances, our feelings. Everything is always in motion, always shifting, always becoming something else. We know this. We've seen it our entire lives. Seasons change. Children grow. People age. Situations evolve. And yet, we spend enormous energy trying to make things stay the same. Trying to hold on to what we have. Trying to stop time. Trying to preserve moments, feelings, circumstances that feel good. And equally, we spend enormous energy trying to push away or speed past things we don't like, wishing our difficulties would hurry up and be over. This resistance to change is one of the deepest sources of suffering in human life. Not the change itself, but our fight against it. We want permanence in a world where nothing is permanent. We want stability in a world that is fundamentally fluid. We want guarantees in a world where the only guarantee is that everything will eventually become something else. The Buddhist teaching of impermanence isn't meant to be depressing. It's meant to be liberating. When you really understand that everything changes, You can stop exhausting yourself trying to make things stay the same. You can stop being surprised when circumstances shift. You can stop taking change personally, as if it's happening to you rather than simply happening. Change isn't a problem to solve. It's the nature of reality. And when you stop fighting it, something opens. The paradox is that when you fully accept that everything changes, you can actually be more present with things as they are. When you're not frantically trying to hold on to this moment, you can actually experience this moment. When you're not pushing away difficulty because it shouldn't be happening, you can meet it with more clarity and wisdom. When you understand that this too shall pass, whether it's pleasant or unpleasant, you can meet life with more ease. In a village at the edge of a great forest, there lived a woodcarver who was known throughout the region for the beauty of his work. He carved bowls and boxes, sculptures and screens, each piece showing remarkable skill and artistry. People would travel for days to commission work from him or to buy pieces from his workshop. He had an apprentice, a young woman named Hannah, who had been studying with him for 3 years. She had learned the basic techniques well and was beginning to develop her own style. The woodcarver was pleased with her progress and had even begun to let her work on pieces that would be sold, not just practice pieces. One morning, Hannah arrived at the workshop to find the woodcarver sitting at his bench, staring at his hands. He was 60 years old, and his hands had been his livelihood, his art, his identity for over 40 years. But that morning, he had noticed a stiffness in his fingers that he hadn't felt before. A slight tremor. A difficulty making the precise cuts that had always come so naturally to him. "It's starting," he said quietly, when he noticed Hannah watching him. "My hands are changing. Soon I won't be able to do this work the way I've always done it." Hannah didn't know what to say. She could see the fear in his eyes. The wood carving wasn't just his work, it was who he was. What would he be when he could no longer carve? Over the following weeks, the woodcarver's mood darkened. He would start a piece and then abandon it in frustration when his hands didn't respond the way they used to. He stopped taking commissions, stopped working on new pieces. He sat in the workshop, surrounded by his tools, mourning what he was losing. Hannah continued her own work quietly, unsure how to help her teacher. One day, a traveling monk stopped at the workshop. He was old, perhaps 80, with hands that were gnarled and bent with age. He asked if he could purchase a simple bowl for his few possessions. Hannah went to show him the finished pieces, but the monk noticed the woodcarver sitting alone. "Are you the master of this workshop?" the monk asked. "I was," the woodcarver said bitterly. "Now I'm just an old man whose hands are failing him." The monk sat down beside him without asking permission. He looked at his own bent hands, turning them over slowly. "These hands," he said, "used to copy sutras. Beautiful calligraphy, each character perfect. I took such pride in that work. When my hands began to change, when I could no longer hold the brush steady, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything that mattered." "And what did you do?" the woodcarver asked, despite himself. "I resisted for a long time," the monk said. "I tried to keep working the way I always had. I grew angry at my hands for betraying me. I grieved for what I was losing. And that resistance, that grief, it was worse than the actual change. The change was happening whether I accepted it or not. But my fight against it created enormous suffering." He was quiet for a moment, looking around the workshop at all the beautiful carved pieces. Eventually, I realized something. I wasn't my calligraphy. That was something I could do, but it wasn't who I was. And when I stopped being able to do it, I discovered I could still practice in other ways. I could chant sutras instead of writing them. I could teach younger monks. I could sit in meditation. The form of my practice changed, but the practice itself continued. The change took something from me, yes. But it also gave me something I wouldn't have discovered if I'd been able to keep doing things the old way. The woodcarver was silent, taking this in. The monk stood slowly, his bent hands gripping his walking stick. Everything changes. Your hands, my hands, the trees that become your wood, the seasons, everything. This isn't a punishment. It's just the nature of things. You can fight it and suffer. Or you can work with it and discover what's possible in this new form of your life. After the monk left, the woodcarver sat for a long time with those words. Everything changes. He'd known this intellectually all his life. He'd seen it in the wood he worked with, how each piece of wood was different, how the grain shifted, how knots appeared, how the wood aged and changed over time. He'd even built his art around working with change, following the natural grain instead of fighting it. But somehow he'd thought he would stay the same. That his skill, his hands, his identity as a woodcarver would remain constant while everything else changed around him. That afternoon, he picked up a piece of wood he'd been avoiding. It was a difficult piece, with grain that twisted in unexpected ways. Before, he might have forced it into the design he'd planned. But now, with his hands less steady, he had to work with what the wood wanted to do. He had to let the grain guide him, adapting his cuts to work with the wood's nature rather than imposing his will on it. The piece that emerged was different from anything he'd made before. It wasn't as technically perfect as his earlier work. But it had a quality of life to it, a sense of movement and natural flow that his perfectly controlled earlier pieces had sometimes lacked. It was as if by having less control, he'd been forced to collaborate with the wood rather than dominating it. When Hana saw it, she was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "It's beautiful. In a new way. Not better or worse than your earlier work. Just different. It has its own kind of perfection." The woodcarver nodded slowly. "My hands are changing. I can fight that and be miserable. Or I can discover what kind of work these changing hands can do. Maybe I'll carve differently now. Maybe I'll focus on teaching you. Maybe I'll discover something completely new. I don't know. But I'm tired of acting like change is my enemy when it's just the nature of everything." Over the months that followed, he did continue to carve, but differently. Some days his hands were steadier than others. He learned to work with what he had in each moment instead of expecting his hands to be what they used to be. He also spent more time teaching Hana, discovering that he enjoyed passing on what he'd learned in a way he hadn't before when he was focused on his own work. He began to see his role not just as a creator, but as a link in a chain, receiving what had been taught to him and passing it forward to the next generation. And he started taking walks in the forest, looking at trees with different eyes. Not just as potential wood for carving, but as living things that were themselves constantly changing. A tree he'd seen as young and flexible 20 years ago was now mature and strong. One that had been damaged by lightning had healed itself in a way that created beautiful, unusual grain. Everything was always in the process of becoming something else, And there was a kind of peace in accepting that, in working with it, rather than against it. This story shows something that we all face, though the specifics differ. The woodcarver wanted to stay the same while everything around him changed. He wanted his hands to remain as skilled as they'd always been. He wanted his identity as a master craftsman to be permanent. When change came, he experienced it as loss, as betrayal, as something that shouldn't be happening. But the change was going to happen, whether he accepted it or not. His hands were going to age. His body was going to change. These are the basic truths of having a body, being alive in time. His resistance to this reality created suffering that was separate from and additional to the actual difficulty of adapting to his changing abilities. When he finally began to accept the change, he discovered something. The change did take something from him. But it also offered something new. A different way of working with wood. A different relationship with teaching. A different perspective on his craft and his life. These gifts were only available because things changed. If his hands had remained the same, he would never have discovered them. You might recognize this pattern in your own life. Think about changes you've resisted. Maybe it was aging, your body not being what it used to be. Maybe it was a relationship ending, a job changing, a phase of life completing. Maybe it was something smaller, a routine disrupted, a plan falling through, circumstances not being what you expected. Notice how the resistance to change created its own suffering. The actual change was one thing, but your fight against it, your insistence that it shouldn't be happening, your mourning for how things used to be, that created additional layers of difficulty. The change was going to happen regardless. But the suffering was optional, created by your relationship with the change rather than by the change itself. The woodcarver learned what the Buddha taught, that impermanence isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to accept. And in that acceptance, there's freedom. Not the freedom for things to stay the same, but the freedom to meet each moment of change with less resistance, less fear, less desperate clinging to how things were. In a coastal village, there was a woman who lived in a house overlooking the sea. She had lived in that house her entire life. She'd been born there, raised her children there, and now, in her later years, lived there alone. Every morning she would sit on her porch and watch the ocean, the view as familiar to her as her own hands. She knew every rock along the shore, every tree on the hillside, every color the water turned at different times of day. One autumn, a great storm came. It lasted 3 days, with winds so fierce that everyone had to shelter inside, away from windows. When it finally passed and the woman ventured outside, she found that the landscape had changed. The storm had shifted the beach. Rocks she'd known for decades were gone, moved or buried by sand. A large tree that had been a landmark on the hillside had fallen. Even the shape of the shoreline looked different. She stood on her porch, looking at this transformed view, and felt a profound sense of loss. This place had been constant in her life through every other change. Her parents dying, her children growing and leaving, her husband passing away. Through all of that, this view had remained the same, had been her anchor, her one stable thing. And now even this was different. She found herself becoming angry. Angry at the storm for changing what shouldn't have changed. Angry at nature for not respecting what mattered to her. She stopped sitting on the porch. The view made her too sad, reminded her too much of what was gone. Her daughter came to visit a few weeks later and found her mother withdrawn, spending her days inside. "The storm changed everything," her mother said. "It took away the place I knew. Took away my memories. Nothing is the same." Her daughter was quiet for a moment, then said, "Come with me." She led her mother outside, down to the beach. "Look," she said, pointing. "The rocks you knew are gone, yes. But look at what's here now. This tide pool that wasn't here before. The way the sand has formed these ripple patterns. The way that fallen tree has created a shelter where birds are nesting. It's not the beach you knew, but it's still beautiful. It's still the sea. It's just different now." The woman wanted to argue, to say that different wasn't the same as what she'd lost. But as she looked, really looked, she had to admit her daughter was right. The new beach had its own beauty. The birds in the fallen tree were creating new life. The tide pool reflected the sky in a way the old rocks never had. It wasn't worse. It was just different. "I've been so focused on what's gone that I haven't even looked at what's here," she said quietly. Over the following weeks, she began to walk the beach again, getting to know this new version of the place she'd lived her whole life. She discovered things she'd never noticed before, because they'd never been there before. She watched the birds in the fallen tree, saw how the new tide pool became home to small creatures. She learned the new shape of the shoreline, where the sand was soft now, where new rocks had settled. One morning, sitting on her porch with her tea, she realized something. The beach she'd loved so much, the one that had seemed so permanent, so unchanging, had actually never been permanent at all. It had been slowly changing all along, year by year, tide by tide, storm by storm. She'd just been too close to it, too familiar with it, to notice the gradual changes. This big storm had just made visible what was always true. Everything is always changing, always becoming something new. And if she thought back honestly, the beach of her childhood wasn't the same as the beach of her middle age. Trees had grown, some had died. The shoreline had shifted over decades. Paths had formed and eroded. She just moved through those changes naturally, not fighting them because they happened gradually enough that she adapted without noticing. It was only when change happened quickly that she resisted. Not because quick change was worse than slow change, but because quick change made it impossible to pretend that things were permanent. It forced her to face directly what was always true: nothing stays the same. Not beaches, not bodies, not relationships, not anything. That evening, her daughter called to check on her. "How are you doing with the new beach?" she asked. "I'm learning to love it," the woman said. "Not instead of the old beach, but alongside it. They're both part of this place's story. Both part of my story. And I'm realizing that my resistance to the change was causing me more pain than the change itself. The old beach is gone. I can grieve that. But I can also be here with what is, instead of living in what was." She paused, looking out at the water. "And I'm noticing something else. I spent so much of my life thinking this place was my anchor because it never changed. But actually, maybe the real anchor was never the place itself. Maybe it was my ability to be present with whatever the place was becoming. That's something that doesn't change, even when everything else does." This story reveals something subtle but important about our relationship with change. The woman wanted permanence so badly that she'd convinced herself she had it. She'd taken something that was constantly changing, a beach, constantly reshaped by wind and water and time, and decided it was stable, unchanging, permanent. When dramatic change forced her to see the truth, she felt betrayed. But the betrayal wasn't real. The beach hadn't promised to stay the same. She'd assumed it would because she needed it to. And that assumption, that demand for permanence, is what created her suffering when change became undeniable. How often do you do this? You look at something, a relationship, a job, a phase of life, even your own body, and you unconsciously treat it as permanent. You don't think to yourself, this will change. You just assume, deep down, that it will stay more or less the same. And then when it changes, you feel shocked, betrayed, as if something that should have stayed stable has failed you. But nothing ever promised to stay stable. Your assumption of permanence was just that, an assumption. Reality has been impermanent all along. Change has been happening continuously in every moment. You've just been selectively noticing it. We tend to notice change when it's dramatic or when it takes away something we valued. But we miss all the subtle, constant change that's always occurring. Cells in your body are dying and being replaced continuously. Your thoughts and feelings are arising and passing moment by moment. Relationships are evolving day by day. Everything is in motion, always. The Buddhist teaching of impermanence invites you to stop pretending things are permanent and start meeting reality as it actually is, fluid, dynamic, constantly becoming. This doesn't mean you can't love things or value them or commit to them. It means you hold them with open hands rather than clenched fists. You enjoy them while they're here without demanding they stay forever. You grieve when they change or end, but you don't waste energy insisting they shouldn't have changed. The woman discovered that her peace didn't actually depend on the beach staying the same. It depended on her willingness to be present with the beach as it was, whether that was the familiar beach of her past or the new beach that emerged after the storm. That capacity to be present, that didn't change. It was available to her with the old beach and with the new one. This is what remains stable in a changing world, not circumstances, but your awareness. Not what you're experiencing, but the consciousness that experiences. Not the content of your life, but the presence with which you meet that content. When you understand this, change becomes less threatening. Because you realize that what you really are, this awareness, this capacity to be present, isn't threatened by change. It remains steady and clear as everything else flows through it. Right now, things in your life are changing. They always are. Some changes you can see coming. Others will surprise you. Some you'll welcome. Others you'll resist. But the invitation is always the same. Can you meet the change without demanding that it shouldn't be happening? Can you grieve what's ending without refusing to see what's beginning? Can you hold your life with enough lightness that you can feel it shifting and moving without trying to force it into permanence? Everything changes. This isn't bad news. It's just news. It's the truth of how things are. And when you stop fighting it, when you stop exhausting yourself trying to make things stay the same, you discover a different kind of stability. Not the false stability of unchanging circumstances, but the real stability of a mind that can meet whatever arises with presence and wisdom. This is the peace that impermanence offers when you stop resisting it and start working with it instead. There's a common misunderstanding about spiritual practice. Many people think it's something separate from ordinary life. that you need special conditions, a quiet room, a meditation cushion, a certain amount of time, the right atmosphere. That practice happens when you sit cross-legged with your eyes closed, and the rest of life is just the rest of life. Waiting until you can get back to your real practice. But this separation is artificial. It's not how awakening actually works. The truth that Zen has been pointing to for centuries is that every single moment is practice. Washing dishes is practice. Talking to your difficult coworker is practice. Sitting in traffic is practice. Feeling frustrated, tired, or uncertain, all practice. There is no moment that isn't an opportunity to wake up, to be present, to respond with wisdom rather than habit. This doesn't mean you should be trying to be spiritual all the time, turning every activity into some kind of self-improvement project. That would just be another form of exhaustion, another way of never being good enough. It means recognizing that the ordinary moments of your life, the ones you've been dismissing as unimportant or just getting through, are actually where the transformation happens. The monastery isn't a building. It's wherever you are. The teacher isn't someone in robes. It's whatever difficulty or joy you're meeting right now. The practice isn't something you do for 20 minutes and then stop. It's how you meet this breath, this task, this person, this challenge. In a mountain monastery known for its strict practice schedule, there lived a monk named Kodo who took his training very seriously. He would wake before dawn for meditation, attend every teaching, follow every rule with precision. During the designated meditation periods, his posture was perfect. During the work periods, he moved efficiently through his assigned tasks, always thinking about when he could return to what he considered his real practice, sitting meditation. The monastery had a rule that monks took turns working in the kitchen, preparing meals for the community. When Kodo's turn came, he approached it with resignation. He viewed kitchen duty as a necessary interruption of his practice. Something to get through quickly so he could return to the meditation hall where real spiritual work happened. While chopping vegetables, his mind would be elsewhere, counting how many days until his kitchen duty ended, planning his next meditation session, thinking about teachings he'd heard. The head cook was an older monk named Tenzo, who had been working in the kitchen for over 30 years. He rarely attended formal meditation sessions. He rarely sat in the teaching hall. He spent his days in the kitchen, preparing food with a kind of complete attention that Kodo found puzzling. How could someone achieve awakening spending all their time cooking? Surely he was missing the real practice happening elsewhere in the monastery. One morning, Kodo was assigned to help Tenzo prepare breakfast. Kodo rushed through his work, washing rice, cutting vegetables, wanting to finish quickly so he could get to morning meditation. He was moving so fast that he knocked over a bowl, spilling water across the counter. Tenzo didn't scold him. He simply handed Kodo a cloth and said gently, "Slower. Feel the water as you clean it. Notice the texture of the wood under your hand. Be here with this." Kodo felt frustrated. But meditation starts in 15 minutes. If I don't hurry, I'll miss it. Miss what? Tenzo asked, his hands continuing to move steadily, washing vegetables with complete attention. The practice. The meditation. Tenzo was quiet for a moment, his hands still moving with that same steady rhythm. Then he said, "You think practice is something that happens somewhere else, at some other time. But where are you right now?" "In the kitchen." "And what are you doing?" "Cleaning up water." then that's where the practice is. That's what the practice is. This water, this cloth, this breath, this moment. You're so busy trying to get to practice that you're missing the practice that's right here. Kodo started to argue, then stopped. Something in what Tenzo said touched something he didn't want to look at. All these years, he'd been treating his life as if it were divided into sacred time and ordinary time. Meditation was sacred. Everything else was just something to endure until he could get back to the sacred parts. But what if he was missing something? What if his whole approach was creating the very separation he was trying to overcome? "Watch," Tenzo said simply. He took an apple from the basket and began to peel it. His movements were unhurried, present. The knife moved steadily, carefully. His attention was completely with what he was doing, not thinking about the next task, not judging whether this was important or unimportant work, just peeling an apple with the same quality of presence that Kodo brought to formal meditation. "I've been peeling apples for 30 years, Tenzo said quietly. "I've washed 10,000 bowls. I've cut more vegetables than I could count. And I've discovered something. When you bring your complete attention to peeling one apple, you're doing the same practice as sitting on a cushion for an hour. Maybe even more, because you can't pretend with an apple. If your mind wanders, you cut yourself. The apple teaches you to be present in a way that sitting meditation sometimes doesn't." Over the following weeks, Kodo found himself thinking about this conversation. He noticed how, during formal meditation, he could sit with perfect posture while his mind was completely elsewhere, rehearsing conversations, planning his day, judging his practice. He looked like he was practicing, but he was actually just sitting still while thinking. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, when he brought the same quality of attention he was supposed to bring to meditation, something shifted. Washing rice became as profound as any meditation. The warmth of water, the texture of the grains, the sound of water flowing, when he was actually present with these things, there was no separation between practice and life. One evening, he found Tenzo sitting outside after dinner, looking at the stars. Kodo sat beside him. After a long silence, he said, "I think I've been wasting years. I thought I was practicing hard, but I was just waiting for my life to start. Waiting to get to the good parts, the spiritual parts. And I missed that it's all the spiritual parts. It's all practice." Tenzo smiled slightly. "You haven't wasted anything. You had to believe practice was somewhere else before you could discover it's everywhere. Many people spend their whole lives in monasteries without learning what you're learning now. They sit in meditation thinking about kitchen duty. Then they do kitchen duty thinking about meditation. They're never where they are. You're starting to see through that." "But how do you do it?" Kodo asked. "How do you bring that same attention to everything? Don't you ever just want to get through something boring so you can do something meaningful?" "Everything is boring if you're not present with it," Tenzo said. "And everything is fascinating when you actually show up for it. It's not about making ordinary things special. It's about recognizing that the ordinary things have always been special. You've just been too busy labeling them as unimportant to notice." Kodo continued his kitchen duties with a different quality of attention. He noticed things he'd never seen before. The way rice swelled as it cooked. The precise moment when vegetables were perfectly chopped. The sound of the knife on the cutting board, different with each type of vegetable. The way his body felt as he stood and worked. The breath moving as he lifted and stirred. None of this was new. It had always been here. He'd just been treating it as background noise while waiting to get to what he thought mattered. And something unexpected happened. His formal meditation practice deepened. Because he was learning to be present with the difficulty of staying with one breath, one sensation, one moment. The same muscles of attention he was developing while washing dishes were the muscles he needed for meditation. They weren't separate practices. They were the same practice expressing itself in different forms. Years later, when Kodo became the head cook himself, training new monks in the kitchen, he would sometimes watch them rushing through their work, mentally already in the meditation hall. And he would remember his younger self. How he'd been so sure he knew what practice was, so certain that it was something special that happened at special times in special places. And how he'd almost missed the most important teaching, that practice isn't something you do in addition to your life. It's how you meet your life, moment by moment, whether you're sitting on a cushion or peeling an apple. This story reveals something important about how we relate to our spiritual aspirations. We create hierarchies. This activity is spiritual, that one is mundane. This time is sacred, that time is ordinary. This matters, that doesn't. And in creating these divisions, we fragment our lives. We're fully present for the parts we've decided are important and checked out for everything else. But life doesn't come divided into important and unimportant moments. Every moment is your life. Every moment is all you have. Think about your own relationship with practice, whatever form that takes for you. Maybe you meditate, maybe you pray, maybe you have some other way of trying to cultivate presence or peace. How often do you treat that practice as the valuable part of your day and everything else as just filler? How often are you mentally somewhere else, wishing you were doing your practice instead of whatever mundane task is in front of you? The invitation isn't to stop doing formal practice. Formal practice is valuable. Setting aside specific time for meditation or prayer or reflection creates a container for deepening presence. But it's only valuable to the extent that it trains you to be present in all the other moments. If you can be deeply present for 20 minutes of meditation, but then completely checked out for the rest of your day, you haven't really learned what meditation is trying to teach you. The kitchen became Kodo's greatest teacher because it demanded presence in a way that formal meditation sometimes doesn't. In meditation, you can sit with perfect posture while your mind is completely elsewhere. But in the kitchen, if you're not present, you cut yourself. If you're not paying attention, you burn the food. The immediate feedback of ordinary tasks can teach presence in a way that meditation sometimes can't. What are the kitchen duties in your life? The tasks you rush through, the moments you dismiss as unimportant, the activities you tolerate while waiting to get to the good parts. What if those moments aren't obstacles to your practice but are actually the practice itself? What if washing dishes, sitting in traffic, having difficult conversations, doing tedious work, what if all of these are opportunities to wake up, to be present, to practice the same attention you bring to your formal practice? This doesn't mean you have to be perfectly present all the time. That's not the point. The point is recognizing that the opportunity for practice is always here. You don't have to wait for special conditions. You don't have to be in a special place, or have a special amount of time, or be in a special state of mind. Right now, whatever you're doing, however you're feeling, this is it. This is where practice happens. In a village known for its weaving, there was a woman named Yuki who was regarded as one of the finest weavers in the region. Her fabric was renowned for its quality and beauty. People would commission pieces from her for special occasions, and she took great pride in her work. But she carried a secret disappointment. Despite her skill and success, she felt something was missing from her life. She longed for something deeper, more meaningful. She wanted to understand the teachings she'd heard about from the Buddhist monks who sometimes passed through the village. There was a small temple on the outskirts of the village, and sometimes Yuki would slip away from her loom to attend teachings there. The monk who taught there spoke about presence, about awareness, about finding peace. Yuki would listen intently, taking in every word, feeling that here, finally, was the meaning she'd been searching for. But then she would return to her loom, to the daily work of weaving, and it would feel like she was leaving the spiritual realm and returning to the mundane. She began to resent her work. The endless hours at the loom felt like time stolen from what really mattered. She would weave while thinking about the teachings she'd heard, wishing she could spend her days in spiritual practice instead of this repetitive labor. The joy she used to find in weaving began to fade, replaced by a feeling of being trapped in ordinary life, while spiritual life remained somewhere else, always just out of reach. One day, a traveling teacher came through the village. She was an older woman, a nun who had spent decades in practice. Word spread that she would give a teaching in the temple, and Yuki made sure to attend. The teacher spoke about daily practice, about finding the sacred in the ordinary. But Yuki had heard this before and felt frustrated. How was she supposed to find the sacred in threading a loom? How was weaving cloth spiritual practice? It seemed like empty words meant to console people stuck in ordinary life. After the teaching, as people were leaving, Yuki approached the nun. "Teacher, forgive me, but I don't understand. You speak of finding practice in ordinary life, but how is that possible? I spend my days weaving cloth. It's just repetitive work. The real practice, the real meaning, is here at the temple. But I can't be here all the time. I have to work." The nun looked at her with kind eyes. "Show me your work," she said simply. Yuki brought the nun to her workshop. The loom stood in the corner, a partially completed piece of fabric stretched across it. The nun approached slowly, running her fingers along the threads. She was quiet for a long time, just looking, touching, observing. "How long have you been weaving?" she asked. 20 years. "And do you still pay attention to what you're doing? Or has it become so automatic that your hands work while your mind is elsewhere?" Yuki felt something tighten in her chest. Because the truth was, lately she had been weaving on autopilot. Her hands knew the movements so well that she barely had to think about them. And while she wove, her mind would wander, planning what she would do when she finished, rehearsing conversations, thinking about the teachings she'd heard, wishing she were somewhere else. "My mind wanders," she admitted quietly. "Then you've lost contact with your practice," the nun said gently. "But not because weaving isn't practice. You've lost contact because you stopped being present with the weaving. You decided it was unimportant, so you stopped really doing it. You're physically here, but mentally elsewhere. That's not a problem with weaving. It's a problem with presence." She gestured to the loom. "May I?" Yuki nodded, surprised. The nun sat at the loom and placed her hands on the threads. She didn't immediately begin weaving. She just sat there, feeling the texture of the threads, noticing their tension, observing how the light fell across the fabric. When she finally began to weave, her movements were slow, deliberate. Each motion was complete. She wasn't rushing to finish or thinking about what came next. She was completely with this thread, this motion, this moment. After a few minutes, she stopped and turned to Yuki. "Did you feel that?" "Feel what?" "The difference between weaving while being somewhere else and weaving while being here. When I'm completely present with the thread, with the motion of my hands, with the texture and tension and color, that's the same quality of attention I bring to meditation. The same presence, the same practice. There's no difference except the form it takes." Yuki felt something crack open inside her. All this time, she'd been dividing her life into the parts that mattered and the parts that didn't. She'd decided that temple was sacred and weaving was mundane. But the nun was showing her something else. The quality of attention was what made something practice, not the activity itself. She could weave with the same presence she brought to listening to teachings. Or she could sit in the temple with her mind wandering, thinking about her weaving, and miss the teaching entirely. "The loom is your meditation cushion," the nun said. "The threads are your breath. The fabric taking shape under your hands is the fruit of presence. You've been looking for practice somewhere else while sitting in front of it every day. Not because weaving is special, but because any activity, when met with complete attention, becomes a gateway to presence." Over the following months, Yuki began to practice differently. She would sit at her loom, and before beginning to weave, she would take a moment to arrive, to feel her body, her breath, the space around her. And then she would begin, bringing the same quality of attention she'd been trying to cultivate in the temple. Noticing when her mind wandered, gently bringing it back to the sensation of the thread, the motion of her hands, the present moment. She discovered something remarkable. The fabric she created when she was truly present had a different quality to it. She couldn't quite explain it, but other people noticed too. Her work had always been technically excellent, but now it had something else, a quality of presence, of care, of attention that people could feel even if they couldn't name it. And the resentment she'd felt toward her work dissolved. Not because the work changed, but because her relationship with it changed. She wasn't weaving while wishing she was somewhere else. She was fully here, with this thread, this color, this moment. And in that complete presence, she found what she'd been searching for in the temple. Not somewhere else. Right here, where she'd been all along. This story points to something you might recognize in your own life. The tendency to divide your life into the meaningful parts and the parts you just have to get through. The spiritual moments and the ordinary moments. The times when you're really living and the times when you're just waiting for life to start. But this division is artificial. It's something your mind creates, and then you suffer from it. Because most of your life happens in what you've labeled as the ordinary moments. If you're only half present for those moments, you're only half present for most of your life. You're here physically but gone mentally, always somewhere else, always waiting for the next thing, never quite arriving where you actually are. Yuki's loom became her practice, not because weaving is inherently spiritual, but because she learned to bring the same quality of attention to it that she brought to formal practice. The activity itself doesn't matter. What matters is the presence you bring to it. You can wash dishes as a spiritual practice. You can have a difficult conversation as a spiritual practice. You can sit in traffic as a spiritual practice. Not because these activities are special, but because presence is what makes something practice, and presence is available in any moment. This is incredibly liberating when you really let it in. You don't have to wait for special conditions to practice. You don't have to create a perfect environment or wait until you have time or circumstances to cooperate. Right now, whatever you're doing, you can bring attention to it. You can arrive here. You can be present with this breath, this sensation, this task. And in that arrival, you're practicing. The monastery has come to you. The teacher is this moment. The practice is whatever you're meeting right now. Notice what you're doing right now as you hear these words. Maybe you're lying down, maybe sitting. Maybe it's late at night, maybe another time of day. Whatever is true right now, the feeling of your body, the sound of these words, the quality of the air around you, all of this is your practice. Not preparation for practice. Not a break from practice. The practice itself. You don't have to wait until conditions are right. You don't have to wait until you feel spiritual enough, or calm enough, or ready enough. This moment, exactly as it is the only moment in which practice can happen. Not some future moment when things are better. Not some past moment when things were different. This one. Right here. Right now. And when you understand this, really understand it, not just intellectually, but in your direct experience, everything changes. Because you stop dividing your life into the parts that count and the parts that don't. You stop waiting for your real life to begin. You recognize that it's already happening, has always been happening, in every single moment you dismissed as ordinary while waiting for something extraordinary. The extraordinary is here. It's been here all along. In the feel of water on your hands as you wash dishes. In the sound of your breath as you sit in traffic. In the texture of fabric under your fingers as you work. In the sensation of your body as you move through your day. The practice isn't somewhere else. It's everywhere. And it's available to you right now, in this moment, regardless of what you're doing or how you're feeling or what's happening around you. This is the gift. The practice is everywhere. The monastery is wherever you are. The teacher is this moment. And you're always, already home. There's an assumption many of us carry that we've absorbed so completely we don't even recognize it as an assumption. It's the belief that something is fundamentally wrong with us. That we're broken in some essential way and need to be repaired. That who we are right now isn't good enough and we need to become someone different, someone better, someone more acceptable before we can be at peace. This belief shapes everything. It shapes how we talk to ourselves. It shapes what we think we need. It shapes our entire approach to growth and change and practice. We treat ourselves like problems to be solved, projects to be improved, messes to be cleaned up. And underneath all of this is the quiet certainty that as we are right now, we're not okay. The spiritual marketplace feeds this belief. There's always another technique to try, another workshop to attend, another practice that will finally fix what's wrong with you. And you can spend your whole life collecting tools and methods and insights, always seeking the thing that will finally make you whole, never realizing that the seeking itself is based on a misunderstanding. Buddhism teaches something radically different. It teaches that you're not broken. That there's nothing fundamentally wrong with you that needs to be fixed. Yes, you have patterns that cause suffering. Yes, There are ways of thinking and acting that create difficulty. Yes, growth and change are part of being alive. But none of that means you're defective at your core. The practices aren't about fixing what's wrong with you. They're about recognizing what's already whole beneath the layers of conditioning and fear and story. Like cleaning a window so you can see through it clearly. The window was never broken. It was just obscured. You're not becoming someone new. You're discovering who you've always been underneath all the ideas about who you're supposed to be. This distinction matters enormously. Because if you think you're broken, you approach yourself with harshness. You push yourself. You judge yourself. You treat your difficulties as evidence of your defectiveness. And all of that creates more suffering, not less. But if you understand that you're fundamentally whole, you can approach yourself with gentleness, with patience, with the kind of compassion you'd offer to someone you love. In a village known for its pottery, there was a young woman named Aya who had apprenticed herself to a master potter. She loved the feel of clay in her hands, loved the process of shaping something beautiful from raw earth. But she struggled. Every piece she made had flaws. The rim would be uneven. The glaze would crack. The form would be slightly off-center. She would look at the master's work, so perfect and controlled, and feel a deep sense of inadequacy. She began to see herself as someone who was bad at pottery, someone who lacked the natural talent, someone who was fundamentally flawed as a craftsperson. And the more she believed this, the worse her work became. She would approach the clay with tension, already certain she would fail. Her hands would be tight with anxiety. Her breath would be shallow with fear. And the clay would respond to that tension, would crack and collapse under her nervous touch. The master watched this happening but said nothing for a long time. He could see what was occurring, how Aya's belief in her own brokenness was becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. But he knew that telling her she wasn't broken wouldn't help. She wouldn't believe him. She had to discover it for herself. One day, he gave her an unusual assignment. "I want you to make the worst pot you possibly can," he said. "Don't try to make it good. Try to make it terrible. See how bad you can make it." Aya looked at him, confused. But she did as he asked. She sat at the wheel and tried to make something awful. And something unexpected happened. Because she wasn't trying to be good, she relaxed. Because she wasn't afraid of failing, her hands loosened. She laughed as she deliberately made the rim uneven, as she intentionally threw the pot off center. She was playing with the clay instead of fighting with it. The pot that emerged was strange. It was definitely imperfect by conventional standards. The walls were uneven. The shape was asymmetrical. But there was something alive about it. Something honest. It had a character that her careful, anxious attempts at perfection had never achieved. The master picked it up and turned it slowly in his hands. "Tell me what's wrong with this pot," he said. "Everything," Aya said. "It's uneven. It's off-center. The walls are different thicknesses. It's not how a pot should be. And yet," the master said, "it holds water just fine. It's sturdy. It has its own beauty. Yes, it doesn't match some idea of what a pot should be. But there's nothing actually broken about it. It's perfectly itself." He set it down and looked at her directly. "You've been approaching the clay like there's something wrong with you. Like you need to fix yourself before you can create something good. And that belief, that tension, is what's been creating difficulty. Not some flaw in you, the belief in the flaw. Over the following weeks, he had her make more pots without trying to make them perfect. Just exploring, playing, allowing the clay to inform her rather than trying to force it into predetermined shapes. And gradually, she began to notice something. When she wasn't treating herself as broken, when she wasn't approaching each pot as a test she had to pass, the work became easier, more fluid. The clay responded to her relaxed attention in ways it never had to her tight control. Her pots were still imperfect. They still had irregularities, but they were beautiful in their imperfection. And more importantly, she was beginning to understand that the imperfections weren't evidence of something wrong with her. They were just part of the process, part of being human, part of working with clay. One evening, sitting with the master after the day's work, she said quietly, "I think I've been treating pottery like therapy. Like if I could just get good enough at it, I would prove I'm not broken." But that was backwards, wasn't it? The master smiled. Pottery isn't going to fix you. Nothing is going to fix you, because you were never broken. You're a person learning a craft. You make mistakes. You have things to learn. That doesn't mean there's something fundamentally wrong with you. It means you're alive and growing. There's a difference. Years later, Aya became known for her pottery. Not because her pots were perfect, but because they had a quality of presence, of honesty. People could feel that these pieces had been made by someone who wasn't trying to prove anything. Someone who had stopped fighting with herself long enough to just be present with the clay. And that presence was what made her work beautiful. This story points to something you might recognize in your own life. How often do you approach growth or learning or practice from the assumption that something is wrong with you? How often does self-improvement become another way of trying to fix yourself? How often do you treat your difficulties as evidence of your defectiveness rather than simply as part of being human? Aya spent years believing she was bad at pottery, when really she was just learning pottery. But because she believed something was fundamentally wrong with her, every mistake confirmed her belief. Every imperfection was more proof. And that belief created a cycle that made everything harder. When she stopped treating herself as broken, everything changed. Not because she suddenly became perfect. She didn't. Her pot still had irregularities, but she stopped seeing those irregularities as evidence of her inadequacy. She could be present with the learning process instead of constantly judging herself. And in that presence, growth became natural rather than forced. Think about areas of your life where you're trying to fix yourself. Maybe it's your anxiety. Maybe it's your body. Maybe it's your relationships, or your productivity, or your spirituality. Notice how much energy goes into the belief that you're broken. Notice how that belief shapes how you approach everything. Notice how it keeps you from being present with what actually is, because you're so focused on what should be. The truth is, you have patterns that create suffering. Everyone does. You have habits of mind that don't serve you. You have wounds that need healing. You have things to learn and ways to grow. But none of that means you're fundamentally defective. It means you're human. It means you're alive in a world that's complex and difficult and constantly changing. It means you're doing the best you can with the understanding you have. The practices we've been exploring aren't about fixing you. They're about helping you see more clearly, about recognizing the patterns that create suffering so you can respond differently, about developing the capacity to be present with difficulty instead of adding layers of story on top of it, about learning to meet yourself with compassion instead of judgment. None of this requires you to believe you're broken. In fact, that belief gets in the way. When you stop treating yourself like a problem to be solved, you can start treating yourself like a person to be understood. With curiosity instead of judgment. With patience instead of harsh demands. With the recognition that you're whole and worthy right now, even as you continue to grow and change. In a monastery on the edge of a forest, there was a monk named Tetsu who had been practicing for many years. He meditated for hours each day. He studied the teachings diligently. He followed all the rules of monastic life with precision. But underneath all this practice was a driving fear. He was afraid that if he didn't practice hard enough, if he didn't try hard enough, he would never overcome what he saw as his fundamental flaws. He saw other monks who seemed naturally peaceful, naturally kind, naturally wise, and he compared himself to them constantly. He must be missing something they had. He must be more broken than they were. He must need to try harder, practice more, push himself further. And so he did. He was relentless with himself. When his mind wandered in meditation, he would berate himself. When he felt anger or frustration, he would treat it as evidence of his spiritual inadequacy. He was approaching practice like a war he had to win against himself. The abbot of the monastery was an old monk who had been watching Tetsu for some time. He could see the harshness, could see how Tetsu was using practice as a weapon against himself. But he knew that telling Tetsu to be gentler wouldn't help. Tetsu would just add that to his list of things he was failing at. So the abbot waited for the right moment. That moment came one winter morning. Tetsu had been sitting in meditation since before dawn, pushing through exhaustion and pain, determined to have a breakthrough. When the bell rang to end the sitting, he stood up and immediately collapsed. His legs had gone completely numb from sitting too long without moving, and he fell hard, hitting his head against the floor. The abbot was there quickly, helping him to sit against the wall. Tetsu was crying, not from the pain of the fall, but from frustration and shame. "I can't even sit properly," he said. "I can't do anything right. Something is wrong with me." The abbot sat beside him quietly. After a long moment, he said, "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Tetsu shook his head, not trusting his voice. "I see someone who is suffering," the abbot said gently. "Not because something is wrong with you, but because you believe something is wrong with you, and that belief is causing you to treat yourself with cruelty. You're using practice as punishment, as if you could hate yourself into enlightenment." He paused, letting that sink in. The Buddha taught about suffering and the end of suffering. But you've created a special kind of suffering by deciding you're fundamentally broken. And now you're trying to use the teachings that are meant to end suffering to confirm your belief in your brokenness. Every time you fail to be perfect, you tell yourself it's proof. Every time you struggle, you take it as evidence. You've turned practice into a way of proving to yourself how defective you are. Tetsu sat very still, feeling the truth of this. He had been doing exactly that. Using every difficulty as confirmation that something was wrong with him. never noticing that everyone struggled, never seeing that the other monks he envied also had difficulties, also made mistakes, also had moments of anger and frustration and doubt. He had been treating his humanity as a defect. "What should I do?" he asked quietly. "Stop trying to fix yourself," the abbot said. "Start trying to understand yourself. Start trying to be kind to yourself. When your mind wanders in meditation, don't berate yourself. Just notice it wandered and gently bring it back. When you feel anger, don't treat it as proof of your spiritual failure. Just notice the anger with curiosity. Where do you feel it in your body? What thoughts accompany it? What does it need?" He stood slowly, his old knees creaking. "You're not broken, Tetsu. You're a human being learning to be more aware, more present, more compassionate. That learning includes struggle, includes mistakes, includes falling down. None of that means you're defective. It means you're alive." Over the months that followed, Tetsu began to practice differently. When he sat in meditation and his mind wandered, he would notice it without the usual harsh commentary. Just thinking and a gentle return to the breath. When he felt difficult emotions, he would try to meet them with curiosity rather than judgment. What is this? Where do I feel it? What is it trying to tell me? It was harder than pushing himself had been in some ways. It required more honesty, more vulnerability. He couldn't hide behind harsh discipline. He had to actually be present with himself, with all his messy humanity. But gradually, something shifted. The constant background anxiety that had been driving his practice began to quiet. He could sit without the desperate grasping for breakthrough. He could meet his difficulties without treating them as evidence of his unworthiness. One day, several years later, a young monk came to him for guidance. This monk was struggling in the same way Tetsu had once struggled, pushing himself harshly, treating every difficulty as proof of his inadequacy. Tetsu recognized himself immediately. "Let me tell you something I learned," Tetsu said gently. "You're approaching practice like you need to earn your worthiness. Like if you just practice hard enough, eventually you'll be good enough. But it doesn't work that way. You're already whole. Practice isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about recognizing what was never broken in the first place." The young monk looked skeptical. "But I have so many problems. So much anger, so much fear, so much confusion. How can you say nothing is broken? You have anger. That doesn't mean you're broken. You have fear. That doesn't mean something is wrong with you. These are human experiences. Everyone has them. The practice is learning to meet them with wisdom and compassion instead of using them as evidence of your defectiveness." He paused, remembering his own journey. "I spent years trying to fix myself, and all that trying just created more suffering. It wasn't until I stopped treating myself as a problem and started treating myself as a person, a human being doing the best he could, that practice actually became transformative. You don't need to fix yourself. You need to understand yourself. You need to be gentle with yourself. You need to recognize that you're okay right now, even as you continue to grow." This story reveals something about how we often approach spiritual practice. We treat it like self-improvement, like therapy for our defects, like a way of finally becoming acceptable. But that approach carries within it the seed of more suffering because it's based on the belief that you're not okay as you are. Tetsu was creating suffering through his relationship with practice. He was using tools meant to liberate him to confirm his belief in his own brokenness. Every teaching became more evidence that he wasn't good enough. Every practice became another way to fail. He was stuck in a cycle where trying to fix himself was the very thing that kept him feeling broken. When he finally understood that he didn't need to be fixed, everything changed. Not because his difficulties disappeared. He still had anger. He still had fear. He still had confusion. But he stopped treating these experiences as proof of his defectiveness. He could meet them as they were. Human experiences, part of being alive. Neither good nor bad, just phenomena arising and passing. This is the shift the Buddha was pointing to. Not becoming someone different. Not fixing what's broken. But seeing clearly what was always true. You're not broken. You never were. Yes, you have patterns that create suffering. Yes, there are more skillful ways to meet life. Yes, growth and change are possible. But none of that requires you to believe something is fundamentally wrong with you. Think about how you talk to yourself, how you approach your difficulties, how you relate to your practice, whatever form that takes. Are you trying to fix yourself? Are you treating growth as evidence that you were broken and are now being repaired? Or can you approach it differently? Can you see growth as a natural unfolding rather than a repair job? When a seed grows into a tree, we don't say the seed was broken and the tree fixed it. We say the tree was always there as potential, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. You're like that. Not broken and becoming fixed, but already whole, with capacities and wisdom waiting for the right conditions to fully emerge. The practices create those conditions. They help you see more clearly, respond more wisely, meet difficulty with more skill, but they're not fixing what's broken. They're revealing what was always whole beneath the layers of conditioning and fear and story you've been carrying. This understanding changes everything. It changes how you approach yourself. It changes the quality of your practice. It changes your relationship with difficulty. Because when you stop trying to fix yourself, you can start being present with yourself. And in that presence, transformation happens naturally. Not forced. Not demanded. Not achieved through harsh discipline. Just emerging the way a flower opens because the conditions are right. You don't need to be fixed. You need to be seen, to be understood, to be met with compassion. And you can offer that to yourself right now. Not someday when you've finally gotten good enough. Not after you've achieved some breakthrough. Right now, as you are. Whole and worthy and enough, even as you continue to grow and change and learn. This is the teaching. This is the practice. Not fixing yourself. Discovering you were never broken. And in that discovery, finding a peace that doesn't depend on becoming someone different. A peace that's available right here, right now, exactly as you are. If you're still here, still listening, you've traveled through some territory tonight that might have felt familiar and strange at the same time. These teachings have a way of doing that. They point to things you've always known on some level, but perhaps never had words for. Or they illuminate patterns you've been living inside of for so long that you forgot they were patterns at all. You don't need to remember everything you've heard tonight. You don't need to work at applying these insights or turn them into a new project for self-improvement. That would just be another way of treating yourself as broken, as something that needs fixing. These teachings aren't tasks to complete. They're seeds that have been planted. Some will take root immediately. Others will lie dormant for months or years before suddenly sprouting in a moment when you need them most. What matters isn't how much you understood, or how well you listened, or whether you're already implementing these practices. What matters is that something in you recognized truth when it heard it. Even if your thinking mind was confused or resistant or distracted, something deeper was listening. Something that doesn't need explanations or step-by-step instructions. Something that simply knows. You might find that over the coming days or weeks, you'll notice things you didn't notice before. You'll catch yourself in the middle of defending a story about who you are and suddenly remember you don't have to. You'll feel the impulse to shoot a second arrow at yourself and pause just long enough to choose differently. You'll recognize when you're trying to fix something that doesn't need fixing, or when the wisest action is no action at all. These recognitions will come naturally, not because you forced them, but because you've heard something true, and truth has a way of working on you whether you're paying attention or not. The monk in the kitchen discovered that practice was everywhere, not just on the meditation cushion. The calligrapher learned he wasn't his trembling hands. The fisherman found peace in not knowing. The woman with the tea house realized she'd been wearing a mask she thought was her face. Each of them came to these understandings not through effort, but through finally relaxing the effort that had been keeping them trapped. That same relaxation is available to you right now. Not as something you have to achieve, but as something you can simply allow. You can let go of trying to be someone in particular. Let go of needing to have everything figured out. Let go of the extra suffering you add to pain. Let go of the belief that you're fundamentally broken. Let go of fighting against change. Let go of the idea that spiritual life is separate from ordinary life. All that letting go isn't loss. It's freedom. It's coming home to yourself. To this moment. To the simple reality of being alive, breathing, aware, here. Your body knows how to rest. It's been waiting for permission. So let your shoulders drop if they're holding tension. Let your jaw unclench if it's tight. Let your breath move in whatever rhythm feels natural. You don't have to do anything with your mind. If thoughts are here, let them be here. If there's stillness, let there be stillness. Whatever is present right now is exactly what should be present. These teachings will continue to unfold in you long after these words have faded. You might dream about them tonight. You might forget them entirely, and then remember them months from now in a moment of difficulty. You might find yourself responding to life differently without even realizing why. However it happens is the right way for you. There's profound wisdom in rest, in letting yourself stop, in trusting that you don't have to figure everything out tonight or fix everything or become someone different before you can be at peace. Peace is already here, underneath everything else. It's been here all along. You don't have to earn it or achieve it. You just have to stop disturbing it with your struggle. So let yourself be held by whatever is holding you right now. The bed, the chair, the floor. Let yourself be supported. Let yourself rest in the knowledge that you're okay right now, exactly as you are. Not because you've achieved something or understood something or become good enough, but because you were always okay. you just forgot for a while. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.